But if we have cultivated a more balanced and friendly attitude, the same words may have a much smaller effect. This does not mean that we must approve of everything another person does. It means that our mental attitude toward others can influence how strongly their behavior affects us. B.4. Select the environment, associates, vocation, etc. that minimize events that lead to negative emotions. The environment in which we live and work has a significant influence on our emotional life. Therefore, where possible, we should select environments, associates, occupations, and other circumstances that minimize unnecessary events leading to negative emotions. This is not always completely under our control. But where choices are available, our choices matter. For example, if a particular social environment continually encourages conflict, hostility, and unhealthy behavior, spending less time in that environment may be beneficial. Similarly, choosing supportive and constructive people as companions can influence the quality of our emotional life. B.5. Adopt necessary lifestyle changes. Emotional management is not limited to what we do at the moment an emotion appears. Our general lifestyle also matters. Several changes can be useful. B.5.1. Lead a simple life. A simpler life can reduce unnecessary sources of stress and emotional disturbance. Modern life often encourages us to accumulate more possessions, more commitments, more information, and more activities. Reducing unnecessary complexity can give the mind more space. B.5.2. Maintain good physical health. Physical health also contributes to emotional stability. Adequate rest, appropriate physical activity, proper nutrition, and attention to general health can help us function better emotionally. When the body is exhausted, our ability to respond calmly to difficult situations may also be reduced. B.5.3. Devote time for relaxation and meditation. We should deliberately allocate time for relaxation and meditation. This should not be considered wasted time. Just as the body needs periods of rest, the mind also benefits from periods in which it is not constantly responding to external demands. Regular practice is more important than waiting until we are already overwhelmed. B.5.4. Associate with spiritual companions or groups who are willing and prepared to help and support when need arises. It is also useful to associate with people who are willing and prepared to provide support when necessary. A person does not always have to face emotional difficulties alone. Supportive companions, constructive groups, and people with experience in managing difficult situations can provide encouragement and practical assistance when it is needed. B.6. Keep records of negative emotional reactions. Another useful practice is to keep records of negative emotional reactions. This can be very revealing. For example, we can record what happened, what information did I receive, what emotion appeared, how strong was it, what did I do, what happened afterward, was there another way I could have responded? After keeping such records for some time, patterns may become visible. We may discover that the same type of situation repeatedly produces the same reaction. We may also discover that certain times, environments, people, physical conditions, or types of information make us more vulnerable to emotional reactions. Once the pattern becomes visible, it becomes easier to change. B.7. Implement planned actions to help others, especially children, to minimize their negative emotions. The final principle is not limited to managing our own emotions. We can also take planned actions to help others particularly children, minimize their negative emotional experiences. Children are still developing their ability to understand and regulate emotions. Therefore, adults can play an important role by creating supportive environments, listening carefully, helping children understand their feelings, and teaching them appropriate ways of responding to difficult situations. For example, when a child becomes angry after losing a game, simply saying, "Don't be angry," may not teach the child much. Instead, we can help the child recognize what happened, understand the feeling, and learn how to respond differently next time. In this way, emotional management becomes something that can be developed throughout life and also passed on to the next generation. Conclusion. Let us now bring the whole method together. Emotional management begins before the emotion appears. We avoid unnecessary triggers where possible. We prepare the environment when situations cannot be avoided. We learn to recognize the moods that make us vulnerable to negative reactions and cultivate more favorable states in advance. We manage the information entering the mind. We learn how to receive repeated information without automatically becoming involved in the emotional story associated with it. We learn to manage emotional reactions associated with physical pain. When an emotion has already taken control, we avoid harmful actions until its intensity has reduced. We redirect attention toward more pleasant experiences and use other practical methods to reduce its intensity. Beyond individual situations, we develop general habits. We learn about emotions and their causes. We develop awareness of their early stages. We cultivate friendly attitudes toward others. We choose supportive environments and associations where possible. We simplify our lifestyle, maintain physical health, allow time for relaxation and meditation, and maintain supportive relationships. We keep records of negative emotional reactions so that we can recognize patterns. And finally, we help others, especially children, develop better ways of dealing with their own negative emotions. The central idea is therefore quite practical. Emotional management is not something that begins only after we become angry, frightened, or distressed. It begins much earlier with the way we prepare our environment, manage information, cultivate our mental state, and understand our own patterns of reaction. If we develop these skills gradually, in everyday life, we can create more space between what happens to us and the way we respond. And that space gives us something extremely valuable: the opportunity to choose our response rather than simply being controlled by our emotion. Thank you for listening to this talk.